Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts.
Earlier this year, the University of Minnesota received some criticism from the Wall Street Journal and also locally from an op-ed piece written in the Star Tribune by former Minnesota Governor Arne Carlson, who arguably is one of the U's biggest cheerleaders. Both Carlson and the Wall Street Journal criticized the university for having bloated administrative expenses. How do you react to those criticisms?
Unfortunately, the article that was in the Wall Street Journal and the shorter one in Washington Post really didn't provide perspective on what really goes on at the university. There were some facts that were wrong or not put in the right framework, and that's the way it goes. It's a very powerful newspaper, and that story certainly highlighted some things that we were already working on. And also some things that really weren't exactly as described. But again, driving operational excellence for us is critical. And as I said, we've made great progress. Many examples. We closed the Office of System Administration, saves us about $2 million. We combined the two university foundations, which will save us a lot of money going forward. We have a long list of things that we've done. We've had to take some reductions in force in terms of people reductions. A lot of work to be done, but it's a great institution, and we're getting more efficient as we work on this.
Dramatically in recent years. Any particular reason for that? Administrative non-teaching positions at the university had increased rather dramatically in recent years. Any particular reason for that?
Well, again, that's one of those facts that's interesting to put in perspective. We gave the reporter a roster list that showed that we'd hired about 1,000 people over that period of time. They were apparently coded as administrators. We didn't see his final processing of the list. But when we looked at that list, about a third of those people have titles of assistant, associate, or professor, so they're academic. Of the 2/3 that are left, more than half of them were not paid from state money or tuition money, but rather were paid by external funds. So for example, you get an NIH grant and you're doing human subjects studies, you need to hire a person to coordinate the human studies activity in your research grant. That kind of person would show up on that list as an administrator. Pretty good idea to get an NIH grant, pretty good idea to employ somebody on it. Doesn't affect tuition a bit. So that left about a third of those people who were hired over that 10-year period. Over that 10-year period, we added 9,000 new students. We opened a new campus in Rochester, and we grew our research activity by probably $200 million. So a pretty large expansion. In addition, our undergraduate situation improved dramatically. We increased graduation rates, and the way you increase graduation rates is by having some people, administrators, who advise students and guide them in the right course selection and provide other opportunities like a career service center for students to do well. So when you tee up the number of people that we hired against student growth, research growth, student success in a new campus, it doesn't really look that bad.
Let's start with one of the biggest political stories in the state. That, of course, at the conclusion of this past legislative session, the Minnesota legislature passed a same-sex marriage bill. Looking back to just a year ago, did it seem then that Minnesota would become the 12th state in the country to legalize same-sex marriage?
No, it did not. A year ago, the fight was fierce over the marriage amendment. But what I think was happening was that Minnesotans United for All Families was having a lot of conversations, raising a lot of money, and the momentum for the vote no on the marriage amendment campaign really just carried over after DFL legislators took over both chambers of the legislature back in November. And so the fight continued, and it became clear at a certain point that there were enough votes in both the House and the Senate to pass same-sex marriage, and that public opinion in Minnesota, as in the rest of the country, was continuing to shift in favor of same-sex marriage.
The Affordable Health Care law continues to draw harsh criticism from Republicans. As a matter of fact, the Republican-controlled House for the 37th time attempted to repeal so-called Obamacare. Is there a precedent for this? Have we ever seen an instance where a legislative body has tried to repeal a piece of legislation for 37 times?
I certainly can't think of one, and I have not been made aware of one in studying this issue. 37 votes on repealing all or part of this legislation does seem historic. And I was initially surprised that there was once again another vote to repeal all of Obamacare. But then I think what really happened is the 80 new Republican members of the House, who in fact hadn't had the opportunity to vote to repeal it in the last Congress, really wanted their chance to go on the record voting for the repeal of Obamacare. Now, of course, they ran against it. It should be well known to their constituents, but this actually gives them something to take back to their district and say, I cast a vote against it, even though I wasn't in Congress originally when it was passed. But there are pros and cons on both sides. I think that Republicans have drawn criticism for casting yet another symbolic vote that no one thinks will actually become law, because of course the democratically controlled Senate won't pass this, nor would the president sign the repeal of Obamacare. So it's just an example of how Congress, casts a lot of symbolic votes that actually don't go anywhere. And it gives Democrats opportunities to attack vulnerable Republicans who cast that vote as well. So there are pros and cons on both sides.
A recent Pew Foundation survey showed that the 18 to 30 generation, the so-called millennials, are deeply cynical toward American politics. Tell us more about what we know about the political attitudes of this generation, and how will this impact the two major parties potentially?
Well, certainly it is hip to be cynical, and that has always been the case. We have always seen trust in government at lower levels than I think some are comfortable with. But these lower levels of trust do not necessarily mean that there's going to be revolution, or that people are, not going to vote, or that the government is somehow illegitimate. I think that there's something ritualistic about saying that there is cynicism or distrust of government, because Americans value a free press, the right to question their elected officials, and always the right to demand something better. That said, we are seeing more cynicism, and that is troubling. And I think part of it is because of the partisan polarization that we're seeing, where legislators across the aisle just are really having a hard time coming together, and they're more likely to yell at each other than work with each other. We're also seeing some scandals, although that trend has really been a continuation of what's happened since Watergate in the way that affects public opinion. But what we've seen in the last couple of presidential elections among younger Americans is a real shift to a Democratic Party identification, at least in voting at the presidential level. Now, we haven't seen these voters emerge at midterm elections, which is problematic for Democrats, but certainly looking at party identification at the presidential level, that's a trend that's problematic for Republicans. And so I think the real question is, to what extent will the cynical younger generation abstain altogether, abstain in midterms, or start to vote more regularly as members of older generations do?
Let's talk about redistricting. What kind of impact do you foresee that having on the upcoming elections?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in Minnesota, not a huge impact. Certainly, the 6th district, for example, got a little bit more Republican, helping Congresswoman Bachmann out. The 2nd district actually did get a little bit more Democratic, although it still certainly leans Republican, suggesting that even if John Klein isn't particularly vulnerable in this cycle, if his margin goes down, that could make him more vulnerable 2 years from now. But we're going to see some massive upheavals in states like California, where there's just a record number of incumbents running against one another, whether it's a Democrat versus a Democrat in newly drawn districts, or Democrats versus Republican. But on average, if you look at House races across the country, because of redistricting, Republicans are helped somewhat. Not a lot, but somewhat. But interestingly, If you look at the national generic polls, Democrats are faring slightly better in congressional races. But that's really not that helpful in terms of information because of the way that voters are distributed. So there are a lot of democratically held districts that are not very efficient for Democrats, which is to say Democrats win by, wide margins, 70, 75, 80%, wasting a lot of Democratic votes. And Republican districts across the country are a little bit more efficient, so Republicans are wasting fewer votes in those Republican-held districts.
There are two aspects to it. First of all, smart grid would reduce CO2 emissions by 12 to 18% by 2030. The vision that I share with you is a 15 to 20-year vision, and it needs patient investment in the infrastructure, and the benefits far exceed the cost of that. One benefit would be CO2 reduction by 12 to 18%. Second part is not only we can integrate the wind, which is in the Midwest corridor, mid-continent, into the grid and into the needs that our economic growth has, but the rest of the nation. We can sell that electricity. Secondly, it would help electrify transportation. Instead of using fossil fuels and oil, we can have plug-in electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid vehicles that serve not only as demand, as load, but small generators, backup generators. We already have the car in our parking space. We can use that to generate, and we have all the components that a motor has inside that. We can use it as small generator during peak demand, or even if we put dollars and watts together, sell electricity back, the electricity that is stored in the vehicle, back to the grid. So we are actually making money when the price is high as consumers, and we use it during night. We charge it when the electricity price is low. In all the work we have seen, it would reduce outages by at least one order of magnitude. So let's say instead of 1 million people being affected in an outage, it typically reduces to 60 or 70,000 people along the corridor that is actually physical damage done. But it's going to require not only better sensors, but technology to isolate, technology to quickly reconfigure the system within less than a second, and we have the technology. The question is not the technology, it's a question of money, policy, and leadership. Investment in infrastructure has declined steadily to the point that in 1995 again, the depreciation curve started exceeding investment in the infrastructure. What it means we are over-harvesting. We are milking the cow dry. We are getting more and more out of existing assets without investing into the system. And part of it is regulatory, part of it is public resistance to new lines, part of it is lack of return on investment, and a lot of it is also complacency, lack of leadership. We used to be, according to World Economic Forum, our electric power grid used to be ranked number 1 or 2 back in the 80s. Unfortunately now, in 2011, 2012, World Economic Forum rates our electric infrastructure 34th in the world. For America to be a superpower, to be an economic power, this is really very disturbing. That's something that we take for granted. The electric power network underpins every aspect of our life, everything we use, and is the number one driver of economic growth. When we look at what drives economic growth, access to affordable, available energy, in particular, cleanest form of energy, the cleanest way to transfer, the energy, and the most clean and efficient way are electrons. And unfortunately, that we have taken that for granted. The system has been balkanized in many ways, and there is a divide between federal jurisdiction over high voltage grid and local jurisdiction, mostly under public utility commissions on the lower voltage and distribution system, and that kills all innovation at the local level. The third factor that kicks in, investment in research and development in this sector, is the second lowest among all industrial sectors within our economy.
This is the Pavic Museum of Broadcasting in St. Louis Park. It's home to one of the world's largest collections of historic radio and television equipment. And it's also the perfect backdrop for this month's edition of Access Minnesota, as we look back at the colorful and black and white history of Minnesota television. Coming up later on in the show, we'll talk with Tom Osman, who operates a website, tcmedianow.com. It's a repository of historic clips of Twin Cities television. But first, we talk with Bud Kraling, who has a storied 50-year career in Minnesota television, most of it at WCCO TV, where he was one of Minneapolis-St. Paul's first TV weathermen.
As we wave goodbye to the chief executive, we say hello to our weatherman returned from the shores of Ely. How do you like your new home?
I like the chair.
Comfortable?
Oh yeah, the table. There just was no television school or no way of learning about television except to come out of radio. So I kind of assumed too that many radio stations also got into television. So they transferred their people, as WTCN did, from radio into television, as you mentioned, went on the air in 1949.
Television in the early 1950s was a pretty simple affair. One or two cameras, some lights, perhaps a desk, no fancy computer graphics, and certainly no way to immediately put a TV story on the air. After all, everything back then had to be shot on 16mm film, which then was developed for later broadcast. So it was very difficult to cover a breaking news story in real time. Well, Bud, you had a very, very long career. This may be difficult. Can you think of any one moment that maybe stands out from all the others? Maybe one of your favorite things that you either participated in or saw during your long career?
I had some really funny things happen. I was talking about going to the Coma Park Zoo when it was Groundhog Day, and I had an old coat that was a full fur coat, but it kind of looked like a muskrat, I think. And I was on my knees and talking to the groundhog down here about the weather or something like that. And the groundhog crawled up under my coat, came up about to my chest, and I was all buttoned up. And I'm thinking about three things at the same time. I'm still talking about the weather, and then I was wondering, does a groundhog bite you? How am I going to get it out? And I'm talking this whole time. And I finally unbuttoned one of the things, and it came out, and I was holding the groundhog, and I survived that.
So often I get the question, is Bud Kraling really a weatherman, or does he just read some information prepared for him by someone else? Where do you get your weather from, Bud?
Well, a lot of it comes out of the West.
Well, the early weather forecast was thought up by somebody at the station, and the sponsor was so important. Because we had a sponsor who wanted to do a weather program, we got a weather program.
Live ads were an important part of early Twin Cities television.
You know, he's all excited he got a pair of skates for his hind feet. I suppose he's looking for a pair for his front feet. Now, I can't see too good without my spyglass. It's kind of snowing in the distance there. There's Towser down there looking right in the front window of the skate exchange.
Now, Ralph Garvey Jr.'s bad habit is sticking out his tongue at his sister. Aha, it's a pretty bad habit, Ralph. And we've got that old dunderhead in our Cartoon Island courtroom where he's being accused right now of sticking out his tongue. Jury, would you agree with me that's a bad habit? Okay, Ralph. Well, that means that if you get rid of that bad habit, just like we did, we'll send you something nice. It's the newest game from Happy Hour called Shish Kebab. Don't eat it, but play with it and have a good time.
Well, I thought, to myself, I don't know anything about the weather, but I've done a lot of commercials. I did the longest bread commercial, I think, that you've ever heard, and very little weather. The sponsor loved it, and I got to stay on. All the commercials were done live. It was a really simple commercial. The sponsor just didn't have any copy written, but they used the slogan, "It's baked while you sleep," and we used that, and I held a loaf of bread and squeezed it to show how soft it was, and we just kind of took off and invented things along the way.
There were some major tornadoes that hit in 1965. I think to this day it remains the biggest tornado disaster in the Twin Cities. That had to have been quite a night, May 6th of 1965.
Yes, I still have vivid memories of that. I was working alone, and I had just done the weather forecast. We had not talked about how to handle a major storm like that. And I wasn't just sure. Nobody called in to talk to me about it. I was just kind of on my own. So I decided we'd keep the CBS program on. We'd drop the audio a little bit, and I would talk over the program from CBS and give these bulletins as we went along. And gee, there was one every minute or so for part of that time.
Minnesota Army National Guard members are often described as citizen soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Eddie Frizzell says the diversity of the Guard soldiers' civilian occupations is beneficial to the mission.
Well, the Guard is similar to the active Army, is a snapshot of society. So we represent the people that we serve, because that's who's coming into the organization to join. Well, we do have to also make a living outside of this. And so we have everything from master electricians, plumbers, police officers, postal carriers, managers, IT specialists. They're all here. But yet we call ourselves 19 Deltas or Cav Scouts. So that is our commonality. But at the same time, we're able to draw upon all those skills at any given time. Right now, we're quite an expeditionary type of force. Because of the drawdown, a lot of the resources that were available to those serving in Iraq earlier in the decade are no longer there. So they have to depend on those skills sometimes to have a fire or to have something lined up that typically would have took a work order and someone to come over and fix for them. Well, it's not there now. So we know who to go to just through interaction on who's got the skills to handle this at our level and within our capabilities. So that just makes me extremely proud of that diversity, to be able to apply it in this situation for the benefit of all of us. And as we remind the soldiers daily, is that if we all work together and we all bring our absolute 100% to the table, we're going to be successful. And when you see all that come together, it's an unbelievable feeling.
I'm the gunner in the platoon leader's truck. If I'm in front, then I'm usually watching the front. Otherwise, we have designated sectors for each truck. But mainly I keep to one sector as we're rolling.
Some of the biggest challenges that we've faced so far is just trying to think about what the next step is going to be. Planning ahead, keeping soldiers ready, keeping their minds focused on the missions that they're doing. They come back here to Kuwait and relatively the threat here is pretty low. And then they go off and they do missions up north in Iraq that may last anywhere from 3 days to 10 days. And they're up north in Iraq, things are pretty dangerous. And so keeping their minds focused when they're back here, keeping them always thinking ahead that, when I leave or cross over the border into Iraq, that I need to have my game face on. So that's always probably the biggest challenge with as being a commander.
Dakota people have been in this place that we now call Minnesota for probably 10 to 12,000 years. That's a very different kind of connection to the land than settlers who came at most, a couple hundred years ago. If you were to ask a typical Minnesotan which tribe lives in Minnesota, I think that the typical answer would be Ojibwe or Chippewa people are the tribe that's from Minnesota. That's problematic in that, Dakota people have been here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Ojibwe people migrated here through a prophecy and came somewhere between 400, 700 years, something like that. So the fact that Dakota people are still not recognized and still not seen as the real indigenous tribe in this place, certainly in this place where the University of Minnesota is a difficult thing, and it's not accidental. I mean, certainly our educational systems have not done what is necessary to sort of really let Minnesotans know about the true history of Minnesota. Every semester, my students tell me, why is this the first I'm hearing this? Why have I never heard of this before?
On December 26th, 38 Dakota men were hanged after a military tribunal, and approximately 1,600 Dakota were marched to Fort Snelling and placed in an internment camp below the fort. In the following years of the war, thousands of Dakota fled Minnesota.
A great number of Dakota wind up imprisoned at Fort Snelling and at Mankato, and those that were not hanged at Mankato in the winter of 1862 ultimately wind up being removed to a place called Crow Creek, which is still a Dakota reservation. And the odyssey that they have, this sort of diaspora of the Dakota Nation, is a huge, huge story that many people living in Minnesota today have never been exposed to this story in school. Their knowledge of it is quite limited. So I think when people actually learn about this, it's quite startling, actually, to find out that the state that they love and that they've grown up in and really cherish has this kind of history at the root, really, of statehood.
What I wouldn't want is that in another 50 or 100 or 150 years that we're really still sort of dissecting the war itself without having a broader understanding of the impact and the context.